by the Hezbollah. There's one flare come down, a second one, and in a moment it will drop a third flare, and there is the third flare. Made of phosphorus, and that's the helicopter over Kana. Now the camera moves back, and you will see the conference room. In the very center of the screen, you can see the flicker of fire. That is the conference room in which up to 50 people are being cremated as you watch that video. They're dying in there now. Now that's Commandant Smith's voice. Roger, Roger. And he says, you were with him.
3-4, Roger, out to you. Hello, Unifil, Unifil officer, Unifil 3-4, over. Unifil 3-4, did you copy that? Over.
Copy that. Did you read it? Say it again.
3-4, Fiji Base headquarters is still under shelling. Fiji Base headquarters is still under shelling.
Now that is Commandant Smith's voice, and I'm sitting next to him. He's just on the other side of that hill with me, and we're heading for Kana. And he's on passing the radio messages to the operations room at the United Nations.
Roger, I have a Fijian officer. He's going in front with you now, over.
And now the Fijian officer goes on and speaks in his own language to a Fijian at headquarters to explain exactly what's going on. Still you hear the drone, you can hear it over the top. You can't see it now, we can hear it. Now we see Lebanese people trying to get the wounded to hospital, and we're in a UN vehicle heading up to the helicopter pad where they're going to try and evacuate some of the wounded. This is through the streets of Kana, in the back of an armoured vehicle going up to the helicopter pad where they're going to try and get the wounded out. Again, very amateur piece of film. You can hear the chopper in the background. In the ambulance you see in the foreground there is a wounded man. A lot of chaos. On the far right you can just see a Fijian UN soldier taking photographs for the record, for the historical record. In the middle, it'll become more visible in a moment, an Italian helicopter pilot, a NATO pilot, there he is, the camera, who's the pilot of the chopper behind us, so to speak, as we watch this, arranging for this passenger to be put on board the chopper, this wounded person. A lot of chaos. For example, here's a Norwegian nurse with a Fijian soldier trying to carry a stretcher, and in all the chaos they actually drop the stretcher virtually, as you'll see now. Not the best way to look after wounded people, but fortunately there's nobody wounded on the stretcher. There's another wounded man being taken across to the helicopter, you can see in the background. Very shortly, you'll actually see the helicopter on the landing pad with Fijian troops tending to the wounded round it. There's the chopper on the landing. This is taken through the rear armoured window of a UN armoured vehicle. Now on the left you see wounded people lying on the ground and Fijian troops deciding which ones would get on the chopper. Many of the people being put on the chopper are dying. I think this picture speaks for itself. You can imagine the pain and terror that's going on among those people at the moment. This is a Fijian soldier, very badly wounded. He almost lost his leg. He's being put in the ambulance for transport down to the medical centre at UN headquarters at Nakura on the Lebanese-Israeli border. And the last scene you see on the tape in a moment is a wounded woman and her two wounded children being told there is no more room on the helicopter. They're standing with 3 Fijian soldiers beside the chopper, and you'll see them in a moment. And the helicopter is already overloaded with the wounded and the dying. And we'll move in on him here with the screen. The pilot has to get out of the helicopter again and order them to go away. He's coming down and says, go away, like he's saying with his arms. Move back, there's no more room, go away. Go away. And the last scene as the camera moves in, this very amateur videotape, you see the wounded woman and her 2 little children being turned away. They cannot be evacuated. And that's where the tape ended.
I'm Mark Bruzonsky. You're watching Mideast Realities, and you've just watched the first time that this remarkable videotape from a historic massacre. I think the name Kana now goes down in the history books with Deir Yassin, with a whole series of massacres that have taken place since 1948.
By all sides.
By all sides. But nevertheless, the magnitude of Israeli technology, the magnitude of Israeli attempts to cover up.
I think you should say as well the magnitude of American weaponry. Those shells were made in the United States, and the artillery that fired them were made in the United States. That is a very important point.
And the money and the political cover that makes it all possible, and that makes the cover-up all possible.
That's you talking. That's you talking. Look, I spent so long investigating this massacre that perhaps I'm being too finicky over facts, but I don't think so. I think it's very important to get every possible detail right, not least because the Israelis got them wrong. What was interesting is that after this videotape came out, what happened with me, by the way, I got the videotape and took it back to Beirut. I saw this, of course, for the first time. And this was within, days of the massacre, so it was even more powerful then than it is now, almost exactly a year later. And the anniversary was in a few days of the massacre, first anniversary. And I duplicated it about 20 times. I sent copies to London by air. We brought all our editors in on the Sunday afternoon, because I got it on the Saturday. And we filled 3 pages of our paper. The front page with a strip of photographs which showed the drone, and 2 inside pages, pages 2 and 3. We just turned the paper over to this film. And then the UN said they had to film, and then they published the report. Now, I'm not saying they did it because we got our hands on this film, though I've been told that that's quite possible. What did happen afterwards, we gave the film to everybody who wanted to see it, including Israeli television. I actually carried a copy down to southern Lebanon and gave it to the UN to give to Israeli channels. And they did show the picture of the drone. After this all became public, the Israelis said that in their haste and their desire to help the United Nations at the time of the massacre, they had made a mistake. And indeed there had been a drone, but it was on another mission. And they didn't say what the other mission was, and I never found out what the other mission was. But I think at this point, journalism has to end and the facts of history take over.
Well, the facts of history are that Bruzonsky watered the report down, but even after 4, I understand from people at the UN, there were 4 different watering downs of the report before it was
I know
released.
there was one watering down, but I don't know about the sequence of others. But I believe there is an original report which is much harsher than the one that came out, which concluded that it was probably not in error, which is a diplomatic way of saying they believe it was deliberate.
Our time's limited. We've only got a few more minutes. I want to go back to the peace process. You say it's dead. Mm-hmm. You say the death started at Oslo, although there was a carcass to stick something in at the time. But where are we going?
Let me just say this. I think it's important to say it. I don't think any journalist, even if he got it right, should take any satisfaction out of what happened, or even a cynical laughter. I think that the results of what have happened, and this is what we're coming to, are going to be very grim. And I've just bought my first flak jacket for Lebanon, which shows you how seriously I take it. 14 kilos, $1,500, very heavy. I think very terrible days may lie ahead of us. Not just because...
Flush that out.
Well, I'll give you an example. I sat in a Palestinian camp in Lebanon a few days ago, and the Palestinians there were military people. They were taking phone calls from Gaza and the West Bank, and they were quite clearly ensuring that Palestinians who had fought in the Lebanon war and who knew how to do street fighting were in the towns and cities of the West Bank and Gaza, because they believe that the Israelis are going to try and go into those towns, that there will be violence, that maybe there'll be suicide bombings, and let us not disguise the wickedness and evil of killing innocent people, innocent Israelis, but that the Israelis will find a moment to go into some of those towns, and the Palestinians, I think in many cases, are ready to try and fight them. And this is not an intifada with stones and burning tires. I'll quote you what one Palestinian said to me in the Ain al-Helwi camp in Sidon, who is intimately involved in conversations over the telephone with the West Bank Gaza. He said, Intifada 2 will not be stones and burning rubber tires. There must be a qualitative difference. There must be direct contact with the Israelis. And he's talking about a shooting war. The greatest fear of the Palestinians is that the West Bank could be overwhelmed and Gaza would be allowed to be isolated and starved and surrounded. I, like any sane person, would hope that none of this ever comes about. But clearly, a lot of people are talking about it, a lot of people are preparing for that eventuality, and it isn't difficult to see how, if this happened, the spillover into Lebanon, where the ceasefire committee that was set up following that massacre no longer exists because the Syrians no longer complain. There is therefore no further meetings between the French, Americans, Lebanese, Syrians and Israelis in the south of Lebanon, which means there's no more control on the fighting there. It's not difficult to see how a further shelling by the Israelis of a village might elicit the Hezbollah to fire Katyushas into Israel, so a second front would be opened. We can then see how the Israelis would feel that the Syrians were deliberately trying to foment war and corner them, that they might then feel they want to bomb Syrian positions inside Lebanon, perhaps even inside Syria, and you can see then a quite different situation, a very, very grim perspective opening up. At the same time, it's also important to note, again, not reported in America, the degree of Arab hatred towards Israel now. It is a fact, for instance, unreported here, that 2 weeks ago 6,000 students from the Cairo University were prevented by Egyptian police with tear gas from marching on the Israeli embassy to protest at the new Jewish settlement. In Jordan, the lawyers syndicate, the lawyers union, has been flooded, overwhelmed with lawyers calling them, offering their services free to defend the soldier who murdered the 7 young Israeli schoolchildren. A Kuwaiti man has offered $9,000 to the family of the soldier because his pay has been stopped. That is not an environment in which people are looking for peace and thinking that things will go, quote, back on track, unquote. So you have a very, very grim perspective in front, and the worst thing about it is that the Americans cannot say, okay, we made a mistake, we weren't even-handed, let's start again. You can't do that. So there's nothing to fill the vacuum. That's why it's so dangerous.
Arab hatred of Israel, or Arab hatred of Israel and America? And the West?
Not of Europe, because particularly the European Union statements about 242, and especially President Chirac's visit to Jerusalem and Damascus and Lebanon, has given the Europeans credit. Not, I think, with much reason in reality.
A little bit of cover.
But not, well, we'd like to sell some more guns to the Gulf Arabs, of course. Yes, don't get carried away with that. But certainly, well, towards Israel, I don't think it really diminished very much. But the growing fury, the realization that America is not an honest broker, but is effectively part of the Israeli side, which it has become, means that America is the center of anger almost as much as the Israelis now. And indeed, if I may just add one thing, I notice, okay, I'm sitting here in Washington now, I can turn on my television when it bothers to cover foreign affairs, and I can see Nick Burns, the State Department, with his little moustache. Then I see Bar Ilan, the Mr. Netanyahu's spokesman, a slightly more elderly man. Okay, so I can tell the difference.
Right.
When I open my newspaper in Beirut and I read what they say, I have to check who's saying it, because what they say is indistinguishable. US foreign policy in the Middle East and Israeli foreign policy is exactly the same. They are one and the same thing now. And only the face of the person reminds you who's actually doing the talking. And what's effectively happened is that there is no real attempt, and there's not going to be, by the US government to go back into the middle ground. I mean, when the Palestinians were invited to Washington, they were effectively told, this is what Mr. Netanyahu wants. If they accept it, they're finished. If they reject it, they're going to be blamed for the end of the peace process.
And if the Americans should attack Iran, which many people in this capital think is going to happen?
I think that's Hollywood. They're not going to attack Iran. Absolute rubbish.
Why? We've attacked Libya.
Iran is something quite different.
Lebanon.
Look, oddly enough, your military people talk a lot more sense in private about the Middle East than your political people do. And
but the political people do the ordering.
Yes, but there is no enthusiasm on the part of the military to get involved in that. And if there is an attack on Iran, which I doubt, although the Iranians are concerned about it, of course, the results would be catastrophic, because there would be revenge. I mean, let me go back and tell you this. After the USS Vincennes shot down the Iranian Airbus, and I was in Bandar Abbas looking at the corpses, another mistake.
81, was it?
No, 81. It was much later than that, wasn't it? It was something nearer to 87, 88, wasn't it? It was the end of the Iran-Iraq War we're talking about. Anyway,
okay.
Well, I don't have my files to hand.
Fair enough.
One should get the dates right, but I can't get it all in my brain. After that, I remember in that warehouse in Bandar Abbas, surrounded, I mean, there was a little girl in her wedding clothes. She was going to be a bridesmaid in Kuwait, taken out of the sea, looking if she was just asleep in a coffin. There were other people chopped up in bits. I mean, another massacre. I remember turning to my wife and saying, there's going to be revenge for this. And she said, yes, I fear there is. And I remember I was in Paris on holiday, and turned on the radio and heard that an American aircraft had blown up over Lockerbie. Now, at the moment, we're supposed to believe it was the Libyans. Who knows? But I cannot get out of my mind the thought that there was an element of revenge for the Vincennes.
You were just with Osama bin Laden somewhere. Afghanistan, was it?
Yes, in fact, Afghanistan.
He's apparently one of the Saudi former establishment families, the financier of get the Americans out of Arabia by blowing them up or doing whatever else needs to be done.
I was taken by his armed Arabs who are loyal to him, who fought with him against the Russians, when, of course, they were good guys in your view. 8,000 feet up a mountain to his guerrilla base in the mountain. I spent the night there. I spent hours talking to Osama bin Laden.
Your impressions of him as a person?
Much of the time he spent with a wooden stick cleaning his teeth as he spoke. Very religious-minded. That doesn't mean he's religious, but I think he'd say he was. Prefaces every remark with words from the Quran. Feels great anger towards the United States, whom he regards as being an occupation force in Saudi Arabia, where there are still 6,000 US personnel. He asks repeatedly why. Oddly enough, the previous time I saw him in Afghanistan, in the autumn, the fall of last year, he was very much against the British and French presence. This time he accepted that they were only symbolic in Saudi Arabia, and that the European Union was beginning to talk sense. So he reads a lot. He sees the papers. He has fax machines, he has telephones and satellites.
Is he bright, sophisticated?
He's not sophisticated, but he's intelligent. I mean, you should have seen the base. There was an air raid
The
shelter.
Americans would like to shoot some of those pinpoint bombs from the sky at him,
They
don't
have
you
the
think?
slightest idea where he is, but there was an air raid shelter there, 20 feet high and 20 feet across, hundreds of feet into the living rock of the mountainside.
You see, unlike you, maybe because I live here, you live there, I believe that the Americans, the Israelis, the Saudis do want to bring the Iranians. It's not just a matter of revenge for attacks against us, it's a matter of cutting down their military power so that they won't be able to do anything in the region, so that they'll be weak, so that they'll be unable to push forward. Now,
Unless they'll work more for us. Look, let's go back to Osama bin Laden a second. I have long suspected that there must be some pretty leading people in Saudi Arabia who support him. I asked him whether members of the royal family supported him, and he said some members support my demand for an end to US occupation. But personally, I think it would be very difficult for him to survive unless he has real support from some part of the leading families in Saudi Arabia. Now, he may deny that, but that's my suspicion. I told him that, but he didn't give me a direct reply to it. You've got to remember that the Taliban, who now control the area he lives in, are basically Saudi funded. You've got to remember that military aircraft bearing Saudi markings bring weapons into the Taliban. So there's something very odd here. Now, if you read the Washington Post or the New York Times or wherever, you'd believe that this man was in some way working for the Iranians, with whom he has no interest whatsoever. Right. Indeed, the Iranians hate the Taliban. They call it the Black Taliban if you go to Tehran. So, and the Taliban are always trying to embarrass the Iranian consuls in Kandahar and Herat. So there is no love lost between the two there. The real question is who in Saudi Arabia is giving real support for Osama bin Laden. And this brings you on to the whole question of the idea of who is behind attacks on Westerners or on the Americans in Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden has never claimed responsibility for those attacks, although he certainly hasn't disapproved of them in any way.
In Washington, we call this the issue of the stability of the Gulf.
Well, the real problem in Saudi Arabia is this, and it's the problem throughout the Middle East, is that there is a dream in the United States that whatever happens in the Middle East, somebody will be behind it and another country will have given the green light and supporting logistics. And the reality that I've found on the ground back on planet Earth is that most, not all, but most of the actions, violence, suicide bombs, etc., are all homegrown. That if you find there is a bomb going off in Saudi Arabia, it'll be Saudis who did it. If a bomb goes off in Egypt, it'll be Egyptians who did it. If a bomb goes off in Algeria, it'll be Algerians. The Algerian government will tell you the Iranians are behind the GIA, but in fact the GIA hate the Iranians and they've got no sympathy at all. During the Second Gulf War, the Algerians wanted to send an Islamic force to help Saddam Hussein. Again, there's no reflection of this at all in the American press or media. It doesn't fit in with the Hollywood intelligence community.
Why is the English language American press as awful as you're portraying it?
Because I think that there is a cozy, dangerous relationship between the American press and the American government and American diplomats. I think that there is much less desire here for the press to challenge authority. Now, whether that goes back to, McCarthyite days or whether it's a misplaced form of patriotism, I don't know.
Certainly not the impression that Americans have. Look at the challenges to our political leadership. Look at Clinton's situation.
But there are those safe challenges compared to the issues of foreign affairs, which involve a lot more blood and a lot more fire and a lot more money. The fact of the matter is that when a US journalist arrives the first time in a city, he tends to go off for a briefing with the US ambassador, whereas I and my colleagues try to go off and talk to people who live in the country. We don't need to talk to ambassadors. We can go and live in Washington or London if we want to know what foreign ministry is and so on. The problem is that there is a kind of pitch laid down, I find, in the United States. The intelligence community has always been quoted. Who, I have no idea, and God knows where they went to school or where they've been or what language they speak, but there's a kind of... I've seen the latest material on Iran, and it doesn't make any sense to me. And when I hear that this may have been behind the bombing at Dhahran, and the bomb may have come from Syria and passed through Jordan, Saudi doesn't need to set this up. You can make a bomb in Saudi Arabia. These are not stupid people. They may be wicked, but they're not stupid.
But here in this country, we also have lobbies. We have influence groups. We have intimidation. You haven't mentioned at all the Israeli Jewish lobby.
Well, if the Israeli lobby is powerful, this is a problem for you, not for me. As a journalist, I've seen the Israeli lobby at work in Britain, and I've seen the Arab lobby at work in Britain. They're both pretty lamentable. But undoubtedly here, the Israeli lobby is strong and the Arab lobby is weak. And given its performance, it probably deserves to be weak, frankly.
The Arab lobby is incompetent, not only.
It is totally incompetent. However, you can approach this problem from various ways. I get letters from members of people you would describe as the Israeli lobby in Britain. I reply 4 or 5 pages over, and I write back to everyone very politely. If they're rude, if they claim I'm racist or anti-Semitic, I tell them they must never say that again, or I will take them to court, because I won't let anyone libel me or slander me. But I try to answer even the people who I think have no interest in being convinced, because they're not writing to me or to the editor to elicit the truth. These lobbyists are writing on all sides, are writing to inhibit our reporting of the truth.
Okay, but maybe it's not fair, but I want to know about this country. Why are things so awful here, in your view, in terms of foreign affairs reporting?
I think that for a long time now, reporters have been very frightened to treat Israel in the way they would treat any other country, because they feel they will be attacked for doing so. They have again and again suspended their critical faculties over Israel, which they do not do and shouldn't do with the Arabs, but they do with Israel. I think there is a great fear among my colleagues, in my American colleagues, that if they get too close to getting a really balanced picture, they will be attacked by the Israeli lobby most strongly. I can give you a tiny example.
It's worse than attacked.
Well,
they'll be removed.
This is what you say. I don't have this close knowledge, so that's what you say. I can give you an example, a little piece on the ground. A colleague of mine, American colleague from a mainstream US daily paper, was leaving the Middle East after 3 or 4 years. The usual mistake, of course, of American press, many people putting him for 3 years in a place, and they take the journalist out just when he's begun to have some contacts and understand what's going on. And this guy said he'd been reporting of the new Israeli right-wing government, and the editor had been systematically deleting the words right-wing. And when he said why, the editor said, well, members of the Jewish community have been ringing up and complaining, and it's easier for us just to take it out. Mm-hmm. And so you get reporting like Jewish homes on a disputed hill rather than Jewish settlements on occupied land. So you have a problem there. I mean, and if you just say homes on a disputed hill, it means that a Palestinian who commits a violent act in response is incomprehensible.
Robert Fisk, I hope you'll come back. I'm Mark Bruzonsky. I'm your host for this program. We've been talking for the last few programs with Robert Fisk of The Independent in Britain, but really in the Middle East. 21 years correspondent in the Middle East. It's been a fascinating discussion. We can't thank him enough for joining us. And the video that you brought and the story that you told about Kana, the massacre, the cover-up, terribly illuminating. And I have to share your intense criticism of the American press. We wouldn't, in fact, need this program if things weren't as bad as they are in this country. Thank you for tuning in. Please tune in to this channel next week, same day, same time, for another Mideast Realities. I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.